So this lesson is going to kind of continue and reiterate some things about the Cold War. It's not going to end for a couple more lessons because it lasted for several presidencies. Um, Within the Cold War, we're going to talk specifically today about the Korean War. Next lesson, we will talk about the Vietnam War. And then we're going to talk about the presidency of President Eisenhower. So you sort of got an idea of the beginning of the Cold War last week and some basic just information you needed to have to understand what was happening. But I wanted to spend a few minutes to sort of dive into a couple of aspects that weren't necessarily talked about the way that I would normally do it. So the first thing, we have this strange relationship with Russia. So during World War II, we needed Russia's help. Without Russia, we would have lost World War II. We needed their manpower. We had the finances, they had the bodies. And so I may have just said that backwards. That's not really that big of a deal. But what we need to remember is that during the war, without Russia, we would not have lost. And so Russia sort of had the upper hand during World War II, and we became the yes men. Russia would speak, Stalin would speak, and we would pretty much give in because we know his tendency to flip sides, and we had to have their help to win the war. However, by the end of the war, we have atomic power, and they do not. And so then we have this flipped relationship because we now have the upper hand. Very soon, though, they then have atomic warfare as well. And at that point, we have this very strained relationship. And the concern was if we tick them off or they tick us off, somebody is going to blow each other up. And because of the atomic warfare, it's going to be so much worse than World War II was. And we're still, all of us, recovering from World War II. So we don't have the manpower. We don't have the finances to face another war. And the reason, like we talked about last week, or you listened to someone else talk about last week, the reason it was a Cold War is because between these two major countries, there were no shots actually fired. But there was a constant fear of it. If you were to speak to any of your grandparents, I can tell you about living through the Cold War, and my dad, and talking about having to carry supplies with him to school every day because if they hit the red button, they were all going to, be demolished. People wearing having gas masks with them all the time. People are building underground bunkers in case the world were to start coming to an end. So we have this very strained relationship with Russia and this constant spirit of fear in the American people. And the reality is this was a fight between America and Russia, but deeper, it was really a fight between capitalism and communism, or this idea of individualism versus collectivism. We really see this war of ideas hit big time in the Korean War and then in the Vietnam War. And I fully believe that it was this time period that Americans began to distrust their country. And began to distrust their presidents and those who were in power making choices. We see a shift here in the trust of the American people. Russia had certain ideas. Specifically, the Soviet Union wanted to kind of surround themselves with what they would call satellite nations. They wanted to have some land that surrounded the main land of Russia as a buffer between enemies being able to march in. They wanted to have access and to be able to build bases on certain water highways of commerce, so areas that are very highly used for trade. They wanted access to those things. The scariest part, I think, for a lot of people was Russia's desire to continue to geographically expand. And as they're geographically wanting to expand in that, they're wanting to gain more land. As they're gaining more land, of course, they're spreading communism, and the fear was that would overtake the world, and this individualism, this idea of capitalism that now mind you, capitalism is not perfect, and it would never be perfect, but there is a lot more freedom in a capitalist situation than a communist situation, and the fear was that communism would take over if Russia, someone like Stalin, was allowed free reign. Now, coupled with the Soviet expansionism, this fear of nuclear war, and I just sort of talked about that. And other nations wanted to possess the atomic bomb, then later the hydrogen bomb, and we have this thing called the arms race, this idea that they have this big power weapon, I need to create this weapon, and then we need a bigger weapon, and we need a bigger weapon, and this race of gaining control through having the higher, most powerful weapon. So, in order to sort of contain world peace, the United Nations sets up this thing called the International Atomic Energy Authority. The United States submits this plan. Russia does not like it because one of the stipulations was that this board or this group could go in and inspect any power plants, or not power plants, atomic energy plants. And Russia was like, no, we don't want anyone to have access to these things. So it didn't really go over very well. And it just sort of continues to escalate, and we really ended up at this dead end in trying to contain and keep peace. So we end up with this thing called the Iron Curtain. And it's called that because Winston Churchill, I think, is the one who called it an Iron Curtain. And it basically, Stalin is going in. We sort of don't think about these lands that had been conquered during World War II. Poland, for instance. We know the horrificness that happened in Poland during the war, but the reality is just because they were freed in World War II from Hitler, their life really was not much better, because Stalin marched in, and basically whenever and wherever the communists came into power, multitudes are killed, multitudes are imprisoned, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press is totally destroyed. That is how Stalin got so much power. He would march in, and if you were against him, he killed you. He would start within the political realm, wipe him out so that everybody with power agreed with him, and then he would move on to the smaller people. And I'm telling you, if you're going to be a world power, that's the way to do it. I mean, it was terrible, but that's how he had so much power, because he just took him out. If they didn't agree with him, he killed them. And he was able to do that because in Russia, that's how he had it set up. There was nobody left in Russia that didn't agree with him, so when they would all march in, they would follow all of his orders. And ultimately, we have this section of countries. We have Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, who are now his countries that sort of are a barricade between the free countries and his countries, as what they called as an Iron Curtain, this defense mechanism to keep his homeland safe. So the president was Truman, and his administration took some pretty secure steps, definite steps to sort of keep communism from expanding. In early 1947, the British, so Britain, announced they were withdrawing from Greece, which the problem with that was that it would leave Greece itself and then Turkey completely open for the Soviets to just march in. For centuries, Russia had been attempting to gain control of this area of Greece and Turkey, so that they could get into the Mediterranean area. The secondary issue with this was that Soviet expansion into Greece and Turkey would then allow them to have a much closer access to the Middle East, which was very oil rich, still is. It's where we get a whole lot of our oil industry, gasoline and those kinds of things. And so we really did not want them to end up with control of that area. So we passed this thing called the Truman Doctrine. And it was announced in March of 1947. It stated that the United States would employ its resources to prevent the overthrow of any democracy through outside interference. So basically, they're saying if anybody tries to march in and overthrow any country that is running with a democracy setup, that we are going to use our resources to stop that. Congress allowed, I think, $400 million to help Greece and Turkey to build their economy, to build their military. And then the idea was that this would kind of thwart or bounce off, keep away any communist government from being able to set in. And there were a lot of people that supported this, that yes, we need to come alongside and support those other democratic countries. There was a whole group of people who believed we had no business going in and messing with these countries that were not connected to us. So, months and months ago in our lectures, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine that said, you don't mess with us, we don't mess with you. That may not have been the Monroe Doctrine, but you don't mess with us, we don't mess with you. But if you mess with us, then we will defend ourselves. And so there was this group of people, and I'll be honest, I'm not positive how I feel about it, because I agree that we should help maintain freedom for those people who cannot defend themselves. At the same time, I think sometimes we overstep some boundaries, so I'm not really positive. I can see both sides of this story. That is none of our business. They're not messing with anything that's ours. It would be different if we had stakes in Greece and in Turkey to sort of defend our own people or our own land or those kinds of things. But the idea was that we're going to appropriate $400 million to help Greece and to help Turkey to keep them safe. But then secondary to that, well, that may not have really even been secondary. It may have been the ultimate goal, was to keep Russia away from gaining control of that huge oil industry. 3 months after the Truman Doctrine, we have the Secretary of State, his name was George C. Marshall, announced another program, and it was called the Marshall Plan. Officially, technically, it was this European recovery program that we were going to help in and help Europe, because we were allies with so many of these European countries, that we are going to step in and help them recover from the war. The side to that is, as we help them, we then can help keep communism from spreading. And so the Marshall Plan takes that, $400 million, and it kind of expands this to as much as $20 billion to be put into the European economy over the next 4 years. And the hope was that as we give them these finances, that we will help accelerate or help promote, push, grow their economic renewal after the war. And again, the whole idea is that as we strengthen Europe, the capitalist countries, they can then help themselves fight against the communist countries. All right, we need to talk about Berlin for a few minutes, because this becomes a big deal. First of all, I want you to kind of look at this map with me. This colored part is Germany. Remember, after World War II, we split Germany up, and you can see there's a British zone, there is the Soviet zone, this is actually East Germany, France zone, and an American zone. Now I want to show you real quick these buffer states. Poland was a buffer state, or part of the Iron Curtain. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany. These were, and look, here's the Soviet Union way up here. So these sort of became those buffer states, so that this American zone has a harder time marching up into the Soviet Union, and we don't have as much access. Now here's what I wanted you to look at, though. Because we have Berlin right here, which is the capital, and we're really unable to reach an agreement with the Soviets about the future of Berlin. It's positioned within the Russian zone of occupation of this area. The Americans, the British, and the French sort of unites their sectors in Berlin, and we established our own currency for West Berlin. So we sort of all come together to work together as one group, which again is why Germany is getting a little nervous, because we're grouping together. In 1948, we established a currency so these guys living in this free zone can all work together. The Germans retaliated by creating a railway, a waterway, and a roadway blockade of Berlin. We can't get into Berlin to give our people who are in the free part of Berlin supplies. So we end up with this thing called the Berlin Airlift. We'll talk about that on the next slide so you can take some notes. But I wanted you to get a visual picture here of where Berlin is, where these Iron Curtain states were, and how things are working, and that you can see that Berlin is situated within East Germany, which is the communist side. All right, so we end up with, like I just said, this issue over Germany. We have West Germany controlled by the free countries. We have East Germany controlled by Russia. Within the east side, like we just saw, we have Berlin. Berlin is split as well into West Berlin and East Berlin, and we can reach no agreements. And so at that point, like we said a second ago, we established the United States and Britain and France kind of unite together. We establish a currency for West Berlin. It's going to strengthen Berlin. It's going to give a unity there, and Russia did not appreciate that, so they put into place a blockade. Nothing could get in through water, railway, or roads. And I'm not positive. I don't know what I was going to say. So we end up with this thing called the Berlin Airlift. So from the winter of 1948 to 1949, we're able to save 2 1/4 estimation million West Berliners from starvation. And the way we did this was that we were flying in planes. At the height of this airlift, there are over 600 American flying crews working together to get food and supplies into West Berlin. At one point, there was an American plane landing every 45 seconds in Berlin to give these people supplies, food, water, all of the things. And the Russians did lift the blockade in May of 1949. We, however, because it was so effective, continued this airlift through September. The second big thing that happened is in 1948 in West Berlin, elections were held. 80% there was about a voter turnout of about 80%. So about 80% of the Berliners came in to vote. And the even bigger deal is that those 80% that showed up voted in such a way that they are rejecting all of the communist candidates. It's very evident that these West Berliners have no desire whatsoever to elect communist candidates. Now, this, of course, doesn't go over well, and there are further threats of communism spreading in other places as well. And so, excuse me, through Europe and Asia. We have to remember things are happening over there as well. United States, Canada, and then 10 Western European nations signed this thing in April of 1949. The North Atlantic Pact. It was an association of nations called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Now, they laid out a security area within the North Atlantic and Western Europe. NATO provided for a mutual consultation defense wherever they felt territory, integrity, political independence, or security pretty much of any kind is threatened, that we are going to come together and work in favor of those countries. This, of course, kind of ticks Russia off, and they denounce this pact, and they say, hold on, this is not simply a peaceful pact with an idea of keeping peace. They began to say this pact is an aggressive alliance. So we are saying NATO's coming together to keep peace, to help each other, to work together as an alliance. Russia is saying, no, this is an act of aggression. It is an aggressive alliance specifically against the Soviet Union. And they then form a defense association of their own, and they call this the Warsaw Pact of 1955. So NATO, United States, Canada, 10 Western nations grouped together to work together to defend capitalism, basically, and to keep countries safe from communists coming in. Russia reads this as an aggression act. It is the actual wording was an aggressive alliance. They began to see NATO as a group of enemies coming together to specifically take them out. They're fearful of us coming in. Remember, we're in the middle of the Cold War. So Stalin is like, hold up now, y'all are going to come in, take us out. So they formed their Warsaw Pact of 1955 as a defensive step against NATO. At the same time that we're dealing with issues in the European realm of things with the Soviet Union, we have to remember we also had things happening with Japan. Remember during World War II, General Douglas MacArthur had been appointed as Supreme Commander of the Allies in Japan, and it was in this capacity that General MacArthur gave directives to the Japanese Emperor and the government there. He influenced some massive changes in their economic, political, and social life. And one of the things that a lot of people don't even talk about, because you're in many places you're not really allowed to, he began to realize the spiritual bankruptness, if that's even a word, of the area. And here's a quote by him. He said, "Whenever possible, I told visiting Christian ministers of the need for their work in Japan. He said, the more missionaries we can bring out here, and the more occupation troops we can send home, the better. The Pocket Testament League, which is a kind of like the Gideons in passing out Bibles, at his request, distributed 10 million Bibles translated into Japanese. And if you look sort of at their spiritual history or their Christian history timeline, there's sort of the spiritual regeneration happening in this time period in Japan, and that has a direct tie to General MacArthur. So this outbreak of communism aggression is now heading into Korea, and we're going to get to the Korean War in a few minutes. And because of that, steps had been taken or were being taken to strengthen the defense position of like the free world in the Pacific realm. In 1950 and 1951, the United States concluded mutual defense pacts, so they go into a mutual defense treaty with Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. The Truman administration also met and put in place this thing called the Japanese Peace Treaty Conference. It happened in San Francisco, and it was signed on April 28, 1952. 48 former enemies of Japan and 48 enemy nations signed and began to work together because of this Japanese Peace Treaty Conference. The United States also concluded with Japan that this United States-Japan Security Treaty, which provided to be this continuation of American bases and troops in Japan. And the Japanese had really developed a really good respect and admiration for General MacArthur, and because of that, we were able to assume a place as an ally working towards keeping places like the Far East safe. So let's jump into the Korean War. So here's a map of Korea during the war, kind of explaining some things. So here's the thing. Russia had invaded and had sort of moved down. So during the end of World War II, they sort of began to work their way in this direction. American forces had moved down here. So you can see on your map here, you have UN forces that are blue, communist forces that are red, which kind of makes sense because communism's often represented in that color. And the truth is both nations, American troops and Soviet troops, had agreed to allow the Koreans to form a unified independent country. They were going to let them become one unit. The problem was, because of this Cold War, growing hostilities and this suspicion between the United States and the Soviet Union made this absolutely impossible. So we end up with two completely separate governments established along this 38th parallel. So this 38th parallel is sort of the line. Now obviously you see the actual division line, but that's kind of where the division was made. A democratic government is set up in South Korea on May 10th, 1948, and this is a democratic government. The communism, or a communist imposed Soviet-style regime sets up in North Korea on September 9th, 1948. That's an 8. And this is the communist government. And this is going to lead to what we're going to call the Korean War. All right, now this is kind of a lot, okay? So let's try to, I know we're talking about Korea, but before we can talk about Korea, we have to talk about communism in China and how this kind of affected it. So the Chinese government under this guy, Mao Zedong, had waged civil war against Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. So this guy is a Chinese nationalist. He is a communist. That's an S, by the way. He is a communist. And these guys have been waging war against each other throughout the 1930s until Japan invaded China in 1937. So when Japan invaded China in 1937, these guys went from feuding against each other to joining forces to take out China. They didn't like each other, but they now have a common enemy, very much like the United States and Russia during World War II. So they start working together to defeat Japan to get them out of China. These guys united against these foreign invaders. Japan is defeated in 1945, obviously, and instantly, the hope was after the war ended and Japan was defeated, they would stay friends. However, that did not happen, and in 1937, they both start fighting China. When the war is over in 1945, they start feuding each other again. Okay? Now, this conflict kind of gets worse because the communists have support from the Russian communists. And so we sent a guy named General George C. Marshall to China to attempt to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to form this coalition government, which would include both communists and nationalists. We had this plan that maybe we could work together. Chiang Kai-shek refused. He realized the conflict would never, ever be resolved, that they could never work together. So he sort of says, no way, Jose. He refuses this idea because he says these conflicting ideologies will never cooperate. So at the same time, the Soviets withdraw from this land called Manchuria, and what that does is it leaves this open base for the Chinese communists and Mao Zedong's armed forces to come in. Communists violated an armistice that we had put in place and began to really fight even more for control over the area. Marshall then returns to the United States and decides, hey, I don't really like the way Chiang Kai-shek is doing things. He doesn't want to work with us. Mainly, he didn't want to do exactly what he was told. So we should just withdraw all of our troops from China. So we did. And without the U.S. support, Chiang's forces were totally just overwhelmed by Mao Zedong's Chinese communists. They were fully armed. They were fully supported by Russia. And by December, let me get my pen working. By December 1949, the communist forces had Chiang Kai-shek and about 2 million national soldiers with their families. They were forced to withdraw to what we now call Taiwan. So the communists are, sorry, my nephew interrupted me. So they were forced to withdraw to what we now call Taiwan. I've put this map back up because I want us to be able to look at a couple of things as we talk about this. So now that the mainland of China has fallen into the communist hands, now you have all of China is now communist. All of North Korea, so all of this is now under the control, right? So you have all of this area working together. And of course, they then Sorry, I was erasing that. This South Korea is now this teeny tiny nation in comparison to this huge land of China and North Korea. And so we have this guy who's the Secretary of State. His name was Dean Akinson, I think is how you say it. He announces that the United States is going to defend Japan and the the Philippines, but that he's not going to let us interfere with the events on the Asian mainland. And this was exactly the invitation, like laying out the red carpet for Stalin, Mao Tse-tung, and the North Korean leader Kim Sung. So they've just been waiting for this open door. The moment that we announce that we are not going to help the mainland, they jump. They suddenly invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950. Their troops, which by the way were equipped and trained by Communist China, by Russia, and they just marched in and very, very quickly overcame this weak South Korean minimal resistance. North Korean forces continued this advance until they reached their capital, which is Seoul, South Korea, by June 27th. So just within a couple of days, they got to the capital. And anybody knows that's the heart, right? You can take over the capital. It's just a very strategic point to take over the capital. So then, of course, our tunes change. By July 1st, U.S. Air, Navy, and ground forces do become involved. By July 9th, President Truman appointed General MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of not just the United States, but even the UN forces. So General MacArthur becomes the Commander-in-Chief of all U.S. and UN forces, which helps, but the reality is they're still outnumbered and outgunned, and what ends up happening is we end up withdrawing. We're pushed to the southeast corner, the Pusan perimeter, which is kind of just like this little bitty area. They have taken all of it, and we end up pushed back to this little corner, and it is not looking good for us at the beginning. So we have this sort of terrible predicament here, right? We are stationed, let me kind of redraw our little thing here at Pusan down here. MacArthur orders his troops to make one last stand in this area. We're going to just stand our ground. We're not going to give in. Obviously, things look very terrible. And what ended up happening is that he's using this as a distraction. He's going to have his guys really begin to fight back and push back way down here. And what happens is there is a little place about right here that on September 15th, there's a surprise landing at Incheon, which is right near Seoul, the capital. September 15th, there's a surprise landing. Nobody knew about it. It's way, way further northwest than where the Pusan perimeter was. These American troops very, very quickly recapture the capital. When they do this, they are able to completely cut the North Korean supply lines. This allows the other troops to be able to come up, join them. North Korea forces kind of disintegrate in this area. Their resistance rapidly collapses. If you cut off all supply lines, you're going to eventually win that area. By October, so a month, South Koreans had already entered North Korea and they were quickly overrunning it. So they move into North Korea within a month or so. They asked North Korea to surrender, and of course North Koreans refuse. And this is where I begin to struggle with the Korean War, because none of this is capitalist or is a free state. They're all communist. We set in to protect democratic societies. That was South Korea. there is a bit of me that believes once we secured this area, that we should not have moved in, that we should have held our ground and forced North Korea out and held them to an armistice. Now, I'm not sure. I'm not a war person. I'm not a military person. I don't understand a lot of it. So maybe they were afraid that they would never stay out of South Korea. I'm not sure the reasoning here, but I feel like there's a very large part of me that feels like once we captured that 38th parallel, that we should have just held our ground and held our own. But we chose to, through General MacArthur's movement, to march into North Korea and begin to try to overtake these communist countries. And like I said, I believe, in my personal opinion, that kind of violates the idea of this idea of the Truman Doctrine that said we were going to help sort of protect these democratic areas. Okay, so let's then see what happens next. Now we have a little problem because, fearing the conquest of North Korea and then this collapse of what we would call a puppet communist regime, Communist China enters the war. They send more than 300,000 fresh volunteers, and now the reality is this word volunteers should be in quotes, because I'm sure, and most historians will tell you, they were not volunteers. They were not, hey, let me go. They were told you're going to go. They cross over into, excuse me, they cross over into Korea during October and November. The UN forces had outrun their main supply lines. They were exhausted after months of hard campaigning. They were simply overwhelmed by this Red Chinese onslaught. And what ends up happening is, by January 4th, the capital has fallen again back into the hands of the communists. The UN troops finally sort of dig these trenches along this defensive line about 25 miles south of Seoul, and sort of are able to get a bit of a handle on and not running anymore. Okay, MacArthur's troops then begin to advance forward or back up towards Seoul on January 16th, 1951. By March 14th, they had recaptured the capital city. Then on April 11th, something happened that really shocked everyone, and if I'm honest, changed the whole course of this and a lot of history, to be honest. On April 11th, 1951, President Truman abruptly removed General MacArthur from command and replaced him with a guy named General Matthew B. Ridgway. Here's the thing. MacArthur had wanted to, bomb Red Chinese bases in Manchuria, which was a place right inside those the Chinese area. He wanted to bomb the bridges. He wanted to bomb the dams along certain rivers in order to break the supply lines and force the communists to withdraw from Korea. However, at home in Washington, Truman and different American leaders were sort of opposed for what MacArthur called all-out measures for final victory. MacArthur was like, listen, the atomic bomb worked in World War II, all-out measures for final victory, just do whatever it takes. Truman's group and his advisors and some other American leaders did not approve of that. And there are some who will tell you that this action pretty much doomed the American forces against this Red Chinese masses. It just became a very bad place for our soldiers to be at the time. Then, March 5th, 1953, so 2 years of really hard combat, Joseph Stalin dies. So the main communist leader of Europe has passed away. And there's these terrible kind of terrible stories that these Red Chinese and North Korean soldiers who were then fighting in the South Korea were begging to stay as UN prisoners of war They would rather stay as prisoners of war than go back home to their homelands. They were sort of pleading to just keep them as prisoners of war, not to send them back home. It was this really, really terrible thing. When Joseph Stalin died, the Russian leaders began to try to push the Red Chinese and the North Korean allies for a truce with the UN. Ultimately, there is a truce put into place between the UN and North Korea on July 27, 1953, but the reality is no peace settlement was ever made. So the reality is this war, technically on paper, never actually ended. We just sort of made this peace treaty. Okay, we'll quit, you quit, everybody goes back home. It's a very strange way for this massive war to end. I mean, the war started, I'm not sure I ever gave you these dates. The war started on June 25th, 1950, lasted through technically, I mean, if we were speaking about the peace treaty that was put into place through July 27th, 1953. So right at 3 years, this war started and never really officially ended. I guess nobody actually even declared war on anybody either. So the reality is there was never even technically nationally war declared. We just marched in, started, anyway, it's a very strange thing. And all of it boils back down to this Cold War scare that someone's going to blow somebody up because we have this weapon and you have this weapon, and just the fear that had gripped really the entire world. Okay, let's talk about some results. We're almost done with this lecture. We have losses. The United States alone suffered 162,708 casualties in Korea. We had about 54,000 were killed. A little over 103,000 were wounded. And I think the hardest to deal with is that there were, let me get my pen to work, approximately, write this number down, 5,178 prisoners of war, or people who were missing in action. Like there was no record of where they even were. And the really, really bad thing is these guys who were prisoners of war, these a little over 5,000 people, because of the fact that there was no definite permanent arrangements made at the end of the war, there was no permanent peaceful settlement made, it was like, okay, we just call a truce, then there were no guidelines and stipulations put into place. And so this is where the Korean War really, really failed Americans, and why so many people, I think, got angry. They were angry in the middle. When they pulled out MacArthur, a whole lot of Americans got angry. Because we then just held this useless line for several years. But the really heartbreaking part is that because there were no permanent arrangements for exchange of prisoners, there were no mandates made, there was this untold number of Americans who 30 years later, records show they were still in North Korea or in Chinese captivity. 30 years. And really what this began to show is that the United Nations did not have the ability to deal adequately with the communist aggression. It was unchecked in so many parts of Asia and Africa, and it showed that they were not capable of reining in this communist long-reaching arm, which then, of course, fed into more fear and kind of fanned the flames of this Cold War. And MacArthur makes this statement. He says, the communist threat is a global one. Its successful advance in one sector threatens the destruction of every other sector. Basically, he said, look, it is here, and if it's in one place left unchecked, it's going to be everywhere. And We were supposed to talk about Eisenhower in this lecture, but we are now 45 minutes in covering this. So we're going to stop this lecture here, and I will change your homework accordingly. All right? So there's the Korean War, kind of depressing, and really that first major war, and it really wasn't even a war because I guess we never declared war, but that we lost. We were used to going in and being victorious, and we simply were not this time. And this really turned Americans in the way that they had a faith in their government. It really did a lot of damage emotionally and socially and politically at the hearts of Americans. So there is that.